If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to today's episode, and I am delighted to welcome Caroline Bald from the University of Essex. Caroline, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I am a lecturer in social work based at the University of Essex, as you said, in the social work and social justice division. I joined there in February. And so I'm what would be called as an early career researcher, which I find an interesting misnomer because I'm actually 47. So this is more my third career. And so it's really putting in context, what does research mean in a small R and a big R? And I am the programme lead for social work and human rights. So it's the first time that we've done an MA in social work with a very much of an activist positioning. So it's quite an exciting time.
And you mentioned third career. I'm intrigued how you came into the subject of sociology. Was it a long, winding road to get there, Caroline?
Well, 47 years can be windy. It's been interesting, actually, because I've also been reflecting. I think any sociologist wants to consider and reflect, and often we're the ones that sit in the corner of the pubs because we go, yes, but. And there's something about sociology that encourages you to really reflect on where you've been, where you are now, and how do they join together. And so my route is interesting in the sense that how your understanding of where you were when you were at it isn't always how you then see it looking back. And so I'm writing an autoethnographic piece at the moment about my childhood coming from working class Scotland. So I was born in Glasgow, and my parents in the 70s, with all the unemployment that was around, signed up for what I now know as the £10 POM, which is such an awful way of putting it, but it was this big promise that if you take your family abroad, it would be a real opportunity, and it's essentially a widening participation agenda of its day. And so I grew up in South Africa, so I could have had an Australian accent, but South Africa got to finish the paperwork first. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up as a white woman, a young girl, under apartheid, and returned shortly after Nelson Mandela was released. And so returning back to a working class background in Scotland, to nothing again really, broke my dad. And just that observation as a teenager, seeing education being used in a particular way, appreciating my privilege in being white, and then being very aware of my loss of privilege as being working class, and growing up in a very, so my late teens was in a very male-dominated almost anti-women view. And so that juxtaposition, that rubbing point between difference of privileges really in turn led me ultimately, I suppose, to start thinking about what do I really want to do out of my life. And it was very much about getting a job at the time. And so I still had this romantic whim, though. I went to university at the University of Stirling, signed up to do an English psychology, because in my idea, that sounds really old, doesn't it? We didn't have things like psychology and sociology in the Scottish curriculum. So I went to do English and philosophy and psychology with the full intention of becoming a poet in Paris, drinking absinthe. I had no knowledge of how much properties would be in Paris, or care, as I wore my cheap knockoff Docks from Clydebank Indoor Market. But one of the things that was a big shock for me there was the realisation how much my education had been leaning towards the idea of an individualised view of the world, the psychologised view. And I gradually started to realise that I was more interested in how society organises itself or is organised for us, and what does society mean. And I guess that's probably where Paulo Freire, one of my heroes, he talks about conscientisation. So this idea of a critical consciousness, for me, you would have thought growing up in apartheid would have really hit me. Teenage years is often the time where we start to go, who am I? And it was very much, I was channeled by education to think in a particular way. So it was coming back here that really was quite an interesting point. But just as you were saying that, it was yesterday I was speaking to social work students, new cohort, and lots of ideas are flying around about what does psychology mean, what does sociology mean. And one student actually today says she feels like she's turning up late to the party and it's a bring your own bottle and she's only brought water. And I find that interesting about what is truth, at which point you meet truth. And I think, I was listening again to Jenny Thatcher talking about Bourdieu and cultural capital and whose knowledge is important and whose knowledge gets quietened. So that's my fascination has always been about who has power and who has voice. So that's why I came to sociology, and I moved from my absinthe love, but philosophy was very much an underpinning for me, and moved into sociology, social policy. Had my son halfway through my undergraduate degree, which was not the best timing on my part, but probably the making of me, and moved university to the University of Strathclyde, having taken a year out and just got some money behind me, and moved back to Glasgow in a really quite rough area, well, tough area, and then went to university, and at that point I started to really become more politically aware, and that's, I would say, is where my feminist and Marxist views started to originate and start to develop, and then went on to do a degree in Masters in Social Work, partly driven by a drive for how many job adverts are out there, sociologists, we need you. But also because I felt that I wanted to apply what I was learning. So that's why, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I call myself an applied sociologist. And I think social work has been perhaps misunderstood in the same way that teaching sometimes has, in that teachers are far more than the pedagogy of teaching. As much as that is of interest, it's also about the understanding of what teaching actually means and the function of education. And social work's the same. It's about sociology and practice, about how do we actually deal with and work with and raise awareness of, create an action around, and hold people accountable for social inequalities. So I certainly found my home and went into criminal justice social work and spent 20 years there. And that was before setting up a social enterprise looking at mindfulness as a way of raising critical consciousness. How I put it was, I get to say, it's being able to say what you want to say when you want to say it is actually quite a privilege and a skill that maybe isn't afforded to people of my background. And I've learnt the hard way that my voice isn't always appreciated, and how I've sanctioned myself a lot. And so from that, I then thought, you know what, I like teaching. I enjoy teaching. I think the politics of education is really, really rather profound. I think only, recently we've talked about, should we have history teachers? Should it be taught? So should sociology be taught? So if anything, apartheid South Africa taught me the function of education, and the power of managing the curriculum and managing who gets taught where and when and how, for me is really just embedded a lifelong interest in education and sociology from that point.
Thank you, Caroline. And we'll come back to your own research in a moment, but I was just intrigued. I always ask people who their kind of inspirations were. And you mentioned a kind of a passion or interest in feminism and Marxism. Was it those two theories in particular that really inspired you?
It's interesting because maybe it's because I'm a Gemini, but I'm surrounded by books. Apparently the Japanese have a name for the person that collects books and has piles of books, and that would be me. I'm quite eclectic, and I think what I like to do is follow my nose in what bothers me, but I do keep coming back to the power. So I was originally interested in Weber, and that third arc of power, in that you no longer need to get to tell somebody what to do, and they'll naturally do it. And so I've been very interested in that over history. So my son is actually now a history teacher, and I think the idea of social history and the formation of history. So in terms of what I would say has guided me really is people like Liz Stanley and the autobiographical eye and understanding self in relation to what you're looking at. And I would say that's very much part of my work with social work. It's knowing thyself in all things and how that's changed. I was particularly started off really interested in radical social work. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my own professor and doctoral supervisor, Professor Vasilis Economidis, who works a lot with Ian Ferguson and Michael Lavalette, looking at social work as a global profession. And I'm actually working with him at the moment and looking at pedagogy and social work education and its association with, I would say, social reproduction. So it's this idea that how I see things is how things are. And that to me is a philosophical positioning that often happens in the public sector legally about what is a good parent and what does that actually mean. So I would say very eclectic, but when I actually got down to brass tacks, and I think I'm really looking at the same things. So the books I've got to my side at the moment, I seem to be drawn to a really catchy title as well, but I love Sarah Amen's work, and she's looking at particularly around the politics of complaint and what does it mean to complain. I find that fascinating, particularly considering my own interests in around well-being and the politics of well-being, and that links back to Ian Batch's work with Louise Reardon. And what does well-being as a cultural concept means. And I think people probably are more aware of it around the language of resilience, and even things like mindfulness. It's the function of it in politics, and to me that's about individualising a problem and making it an individualised response to the detriment of recognising that there's an organisational response that arguably, when you consider that following the power, is probably what arguably is the more important. But I'm also interested in Berman, The Politics of Authenticity, and Barrett, The Politics of Truth. But a book that really got me over the summer was Professor Imogen Tyler, and Stigma, The Machinery of Inequality. And that just got me. I just sat there and absolutely devoured it. And the use of stigma power. And linking again to my interest in unspoiled identity and what does that mean, and how do you unspoil identity and who actually decided it was spoiled in the first place. there's just so much. And for me, it's interesting even looking at where sociology lives. You don't necessarily have to label it sociology for it to be sociology.
Yes.
If you're purely concerned with how people organise themselves. I remember submitting an assignment. Of course, I'm telling you this now, many years, so they can't fail me. I literally was late in handing in an assignment back in my undergraduate, and I literally wrote an observation. It was now I know it was an ethnographic study of where people sat on a bus. And, in hindsight, it was actually really quite poignant. And I was looking at it and the other day, and written in green pen, it shows you how long ago I was writing. And it was looking at critical race theory, and it was looking at the beginnings for me in terms of intersectionality. And we only have to look at the media, this last few months to see how even something as given as critical race theory has been thrown out as being outlandish or a political enemy. And if that doesn't say to you sociology is right on the edge, then I don't know what else will.
And I find that really interesting. You said there's kind of the common link of power, and how you've kind of experienced both sides of it. That's really interesting. So in terms of ethnicity, you've been on one side of the debate, but as a female and working class, you've been on the other side of the debate as well.
Yes, and I find it interesting. I wrote actually a blog post for working class academics, and they're a marvellous group on Twitter mainly, but a group of people that got together and Peter leading it, and they did this conference. It was during COVID, so it was unfortunate not to be able to get together, but in being online, it actually created a very different type of space, a levelling space, if you like. Rather than levelling up, everyone was already, disregarding of the concept of level. So it was really engaging and really inclusive. And I wrote in there about the use of language, and it was about not upsetting. I think I called it something witty, like not upsetting the apple cart, because you're going to have to hold the apples, and that's been something that I've been very conscious of all my life. That by all means speak up, but there will be consequences. And I think that linked back to my interest of Sarah Ahmed's work around perhaps even looking at bullying in academia, and how does bullying manage itself and hold power in spaces, particularly in social work, where you would have thought people would be more acutely aware of the intention of wanting to be inclusive. And so that seemed to have struck a chord, and that led me on to being asked if I would like to write an autoethnographic article in a new autoethnographic journal led by Di Galpin. And she's been incredibly encouraging to me, because as you can appreciate, I've not got a South African accent, and it's really been as a result of my dad being incredibly staunchly Scottish. So I had a South African accent at school, but a Scottish accent at home. And as a result, what's happened is I've got a very soft accent. And speaking to colleagues at the University of Essex and beyond who are white South African women now working here, one colleague said about this concept of my accent allowing me to pass. And I find that fascinating and it's in my research that I'm really interested about if we say this is how things should look like, as in terms of a cookie cutter, you need to be this shape, this depth, this colour. How do people in need, and austerity has made more people in need, how do people in need make sure that the person who manages that cookie cutter knows that you're one of them enough to be invited in? So in that statement, there's already presupposition that there is a room that I'm not in, that I need to be invited. Who does the inviting? Who shaped the cookie cutter? Am I ever likely to shape that cookie cutter? is it designed for someone else? But there's a trap there. And I've been very conscious of flitting between different worlds, because I'm from Glasgow, grew up in Durban, but I've been living the majority of my life, really. 20 years I've been in Essex. So again, another accent, and my children have been brought up with an Essex accent. And so I've been really interested, probably over my whole life, really, in terms of fluid identity and what does identity mean. And as I'm getting older, I'm more appreciative as well of age. And what does it mean to be a mum of 2 adult children working in education? And that's fascinating to me. It's like your life becomes a sociological study.
Yes.
And you wouldn't leave the house otherwise, would you? just the little bills to pay. But it's fascinating to me that all these internal worlds are happening all at once. And then it's like that film in Crash. We all bounce together. And between that, every single time we have a conversation, there's a sense of a calibration about, are you one of us, or are you not? And that goes back to Bourdieu and cultural capital and the work of Professor Diane Ray, who absolute hero.
Yes.
Just in the way she is, I have to say. I had the pleasure, honestly, the honour of meeting her, and I transformed into a fangirl and went up and spoke to her, and it's the unassuming, and I think that to me is the ultimate feminist researcher. It's ultimately down to her DNA inclusive, and very much aware of the risk of becoming a hero worship. She absolutely, I lapped up her work as well. It was really important to me. So it's been really interesting to me also being in the constituency of staunch Conservative MPs and Priti Patel up the road and Vicky Ford here. And so I think this is where sociology is fascinating, because the sociological route that I've taken is that nothing is decided, and anything you believe is decided was decided by someone else for a purpose. And yes, it doesn't make it easy for pub conversations, but I really do believe that. I don't think there's an absolute truth, which is confusing for some, I think, particularly given if you've been brought up to believe or you rely heavily on fact. And I think this is what we're seeing currently politically, is a loosening of what you can trust. And I think that's left a lot of people feeling very unsettled.
Yeah. There's levels of anxiety. And I must say as well, thank you for mentioning Diane Ray. I am going to plug the episode that I've had with Diane Ray, not just so more people listen to it if they haven't already, but it is, I think, the biggest downloaded episode that I've ever done. So you're not alone in your fangirldom by any means.
I'm not surprised. I've shared it a number of times, and I think that was one of the ways I actually came to find you, and then started looking at your back catalogue. And I think it's really cool, even just the concept of a podcast, and being able to discuss it. But no, obviously incredibly listenable, but made absolute sense and was really interesting. So, thank you. It was a bit of a coup on your part, wasn't it? Well done, you.
Oh, yeah. It was a real honour to speak to her.
Oh, I bet. I can imagine, actually, yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. That's going to be the end of part 1. And in part 2, we're going to talk more about your own research.
Thank you.
Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Caroline Bald from the University of Essex. Caroline, in part 1, we talked a little bit about your journey into the world of sociology. Do you want to tell us more about what your research is focused on, please?
Of course. So first of all, I think as a career, I've always been a researcher in that I'm downright nosy. And it's learning to be a researcher with a small r, but also being a researcher with a capital R. So understanding the function of research, understanding your position in terms of research, and understanding the ethics dynamics of it. So where I'm at now is my first proper post where I'm actually paid to do research, which is, I have to say, an absolute thrill. And it's meant that I have the freedom to do a number of areas of research, and being paid to do it, I have to say, is an incredible gift that's not afforded to a number of researchers out there. So I absolutely take my hat off to them that actually go ahead and actually do it themselves. So it's understanding where I've positioned myself as an applied researcher. So I'm looking specifically at practice. I'm also a researcher activist in that I'm using my radical community work roots to work with local charities and national charities to make things happen. But I'm also a working researcher, so I'm a colleague on a number of quite large beds to do specific pieces of work. So, I mean, would it be okay if I just share what I'm working on?
Yeah, please do, yeah.
So I'm doing a professional doctorate in social care education, and I just want to do a wee shout out, if I can, about the professional doctorate route, because often we hear about PhDs, and of course I knew what a PhD vaguely was, but it certainly wasn't something that I could do, and or didn't think I could do. And when I joined my original university, I was sort of looking at PhDs, and then I gradually realised that was a PhD what I was really thinking it was. And a professional doctorate is an opportunity to use those first, second, third careers and look at a specific aspect of practice. And as soon as I say that I get to make change, PhD students go, I think you'll find I also get to make change. But what I will say is I've yet to see a PhD student not correct me for telling them that they're doing a prof doc. So there's something about a class, there's something about who's more right. Is a PhD got more weight than a prof doc? And, you know, there's a reality, but there's also, let's face it, an opportunity in doing a prof doc, in that you get a good section of time, 2 years, to actually work on your skills as you are now, in terms of looking at, you know, as when I started 3 years ago, what does a 44-year-old woman in social work see in terms of research? So that was an opportunity. So what I'm doing in my professional doctorate is linked to a number of different aspects of the work I'm doing at the moment. So I am particularly interested in access and how education is gatekept. And so the work that I'm doing at the moment is looking at social work admissions as an example of access. So I mentioned before that my son's a teacher, so it's similar in teaching, it's similar in nursing, occupational therapy colleagues, speech and language colleagues, therapy colleagues are talking about the same. It's this idea of who comes in, where it works out to be who goes into the profession. So I'm doing a piece of work at the moment with Dr. Aaron Wiley, and we're looking at criminal records and the use of criminal records in the social work education admissions processes. And separate to that, I'm working with two national charities. So Rachel Tynan, who is the policy and practice lead at Unlock, and they're looking to really grapple with the fact that 1 in 4 adults has a criminal record, and yet criminal records is seen as the ultimate barrier to work and education, which I have to say is gendered and racialised as well, when you consider that policing is not equitable across the UK, let alone looking at policing globally. I'm also working with Olivia de Navi, and she's based at, she's a policy and research officer at Working Chance, who is an incredible organisation working with women who have convictions, and looking at how employment being the second biggest indicator of being able to move on. And they're doing incredible work. In fact, she was saying to me the other day that for women that are coming out of custody, about 58% of them reoffend, but women that are working with them, they've only got a 2% reconviction rate. And so, I mean, that either says to me two things: they're absolutely brilliant at what they do, and that may be the case. I'm not going to doubt that. Or it just shows you that when you do something, you make a difference. And I find it exciting, but also disappointing that probation, which is my original career as a criminal justice social worker, I worked in probation in Essex. and my varying roles, including my last role being around serious further offence reviews and serious case reviews. And I gradually saw a real rolling back of criminal justice being led by Michael Howard saying nothing works, if you remember him. And I think some people refer to him still as the Dark Lord. But there was this real sense that what was working in the past has been absolutely rolled back. And I think that all these pieces of work really link together in looking at where does criminal records fit with this whole idea of being able to move on and how women are doubly clobbered. So I remember back in my day, I was particularly interested in Stan Cohen's work, and this idea of folk devils, but also another group about feminist researchers looking at how girls offend and that whole idea that women offend differently, and yet they really are hit hard by patriarchal views, as well as this idea of mad, bad and sad is very much evident there. So I'm very much involved in, for me, research is about pulling people together and sharing common themes from different strengths and making that go forward. So her hope is to actually apply for funding, because one of the things that I've noticed, or what we've noticed here in the UK, particularly in England, isn't the same as what's happening across the world. So to be able to understand it from an international perspective would be exciting. Another area of work that I'm involved in is working with Mental Health Time for Action, and they're a charity looking at raising awareness, action and accountability around mental health and health inequalities. So I recently contributed a chapter to a COVID publication through the University of Essex, and it was looking at how COVID has impacted disproportionately in terms of what is pre-existing health inequalities. So again, it feels a bit, you're not saying anything new here, but it's been surprising how few people had actually made the connection that defunding the NHS is as political as defunding the police appears to be now. If you look at across the water to Trump and talking about defunding the police. But I'm very interested in I'm also interested in methodologies, really, and I'm particularly interested in the burgeoning, particularly during COVID, of Twitter specifically, but not exclusively. And I'm particularly interested in digital activism and how, I know it, following the way of Kim Kardashian doesn't probably sit very well with sociology, but she noticed very quickly that she was able to speak directly to followers, and in a way actually changed how our relationship with truth. And all I know now is that within minutes, if not hours, I'm aware of America looking to recruit social workers to work with police and the campaign against that. A social worker being arrested in Hong Kong for political activism, and all shades in between about where is the function of social work and where does it sit. And I believe that links back to the work of the International Federation of Social Work and the British Association of Social Work, and that cross-pollination, if you like, with sociology and sociological movements, including the Social History Society, the Working Class Academics, and obviously the British Sociological Society. So I think for me, in terms of research, it's an opportunity to reflect on policy and practice and the implications and the impact on different groups. But then also to roll up sleeves and actually producing more evidence. And I put emphasis on more evidence because there's a bit of me that started to really question, when does awareness become enough? And when does awareness really need to tip into activism? And is that the role of a researcher? And I would argue that it's always been the role of the researcher, but others would argue it's not. So again, that comes back to Liz Stanley and knowing why you're asking the questions in the first place. And it's two things that I keep coming back to that I share with students is how you solve a problem depends on how you see it, and also how you see a problem doesn't mean how it is. And they usually blow their socks at that point and go, can you just tell me what you mean? And I think for me, it's about the position of a researcher to make actual change. And that's where, to me, observing what's happening on Twitter, but also becoming an agent of change, questioning capitalism as an ideology, questioning austerity. Linking austerity with a party feels very uncomfortable at the moment for me. So it's still something that I'm working through. But the ideologies are bouncing off each other. And that's me using myself as data. So it's been fascinating because I'm also involved in two bids. One of them's looking at acquired brain injury and women who have experienced domestic violence. And again, that's looking at how women experience sexism, but also classism. And another bid is looking at mental health from the position of adolescent mental health, and it's looking at creating a virtual learning environment, a virtual environment, if you like, where young people can actually really explore what it means to be emotionally well. So it's brought me back to the beginning, if you like, about what is well-being and this concept of bon vivre and very central Aristotle life of, what is a good life and who decides that. And so growing children in a space where owning a Porsche is a good life versus my view of a good life in terms of contentment and what does equality mean and happiness has been a fascinating journey. So it's been really interesting, even just reflecting coming on to this. So what does a sociologist do? And if anything, we're there, we're nosy, we're curious, we're posing questions. We're not assuming that there's a solution. And that doesn't mean that we're any less effective as a result. It's fools that create immediate responses. Some problems are not simply resolved and others very much are. So I think it would be interesting to reflect on what the public's view of a sociologist is, particularly given that conversation that's bumping around about whether sociology is a reasonable subject to have at school.
Yes.
But to me, if you take out sociology and you put in humanities, or even, for me, it was English, it's all about critical consciousness. However we label it, it's about the art of teaching. And no matter how much the government of the day might dictate how education is delivered, it's the skills of the teachers and the hearts and heads and passions of the teachers that shape the voice in which it was given, and no amount of power can change that. And so I would certainly encourage teachers of all spaces, from being a parent to being a professor, to really reflect on the power of teaching and passing on stories and trusting children to adults to find their own space and place within that knowledge.
And can I ask you, so the one bit that I was really intrigued by that, with what you just said is, there is this idea that a good sociologist is not just studying something, but they want to change it. How do you make that next leap? How do you actually make social change rather than just coming up with the theoretical?
And I think that's where it's a really good question. And I suppose there's a number of ways of answering that. To me, change isn't a one-person job. I think when it is, we've got to really worry. And so I think, the other aspect is that no one idea was the first time anyone's ever thought of that. So I often, I'm a particular lover of Foucault. So currently sitting on my bedstand, that's who I wake up to every morning. And not a pleasant view every now and again. But his ideas came from, and I like the idea that ideas, I think the fact that sociology contributes to the discussion is in itself an activist perspective. So the fact that you've got somebody who's not a male professor sitting here in a podcast with you is already making a change, that somebody might hear my dulcet tones and think, well, maybe sociology and social work, gosh, I can see how social work is actually interesting. It's not about what we think it is. It's about making change and activism. The reality is a lot of academics do additional work that's not in their role necessarily, and that's as trustee, being involved in that, sharing petitions, developing petitions. So I was followed, for example, the work of Article 39 and their work, really incredible work around really challenging the government judicial review about the introduction in April by stealth of the statutory instrument 445, which relaxed, which is an awful word, along with easements. I mean, again, I love discourse and the power of language. How can you ease a legal obligation? They basically said, I think there was 60 odd provisions to protect children were relaxed, and local authorities no longer had the requirement to protect children in the same way. And they came to the fore and they created a hashtag, a campaign, change.org, crowdfund, and through that they really held governments the sticking post. And that to me is activism, and that to me is research. And to the fact that they received an award for that is a testament to the fact that as academics we have a responsibility to step up and say things and support wherever we can. But I'm going to put next to that a caveat that all too often at the moment there's a narrative to say that if you don't stand up and shout something down, that means you're complicit. And I actually really want to ask people to reflect on what it actually takes for somebody to stand up. And just because I stand up doesn't mean I was ever sitting down. So to be able to challenge discrimination is done in so many different ways. And be careful of assuming that the only people that shout out are the only voices that can be heard. So I think, to answer your question, activism is in every tweet. It's in your personhood. It's how you go about things on a day-to-day basis, knowing yourself and what you stand for and what you won't stand for. It doesn't need to be somebody wearing a cape. But to me, it's about those people who are in a position of privilege. So such as professors, I'm not saying all are, but when you do have that opportunity to say something that helps those people behind you, please do, and call out discrimination where you can, because those people who feel that they're not able to are hearing you, they are listening, and just because you don't hear them doesn't mean they're not speaking. People like Diane Ray, for example, Professor Diane Ray, being able to say what she has said has enabled a whole generation of women academics say, my accent has meant this. I've been told to cut my hair if I wanted to get promotion. Male managers tell me to manage my face if I wanted to get this or that. Excluded from rooms by talk of football because that was code. So labelling it, Kimberly Crenshaw calling it intersectionality, me recognising that class and gender for me was just playing off each other. That to me is activism. And I think sociology for me, not to discredit any psychologists out there, but I just feel sociology really have, run roughshod over spaces that we're meant to be and where we're not meant to be. And suppose when I thought about coming on to say what I wanted to say was, as a social worker, social work is also sociological in its premise as well. And as a social worker, I feel in a position to be both critical of social but also worker in terms of activist. I know that's not a simple argument, and a lot of people have views, rightly so, of social work. Lots of comments about teachers as well, but for me, social work comes into social and work, and I feel inherent in the role that I do, or have always done, is that I've got to do the work, and for me, social is central.
Thank you, Caroline. That's such an important message, and you put it so eloquently. So I'm really, really delighted that you put that message out there, and I'm sure a lot of people have been listening and nodding in agreement as well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask you I always ask people to finish off by saying where people can read more of your work or follow you on Twitter. How could they get in touch if they want to find out more about you?
Oh, I do haunt Twitter rather too often. So I'm Caroline J. Bald, Bald. If you want to remember me, it's Baldilocks to my friends. Caroline J. Bald. And I share there, and mostly in my space, in terms of what I find interesting, and it seems to resonate with other people too. Research-wise, the link on my Twitter account takes you to my, what we call the Orchid account, which is all the things that I've been writing about. And in there is also the blog posts, and that's that grey literature that often academia excludes, and grey literature is from the personal experience. It's not seen as the higher brow literature. So I've included in there blog posts about where I've really reflected, and I will be adding to that about reading and writing. But I'm always up for discussion. So if you do listen to this and you'd be keen to ask me more questions about anything really, social work and sociology, then please get in touch.
Great. And keep flying that flag for activism, Caroline.
Oh, I can't help not to. I think it's part of my DNA.
Thank you very much for your time today, Caroline. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's been fabulous. Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for the Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes, and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.